Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Elena Vasquez Sterling, and for the past 3 months, I have been conducting an undercover federal investigation into the most sophisticated suburban financial predation scheme in Colorado history. The stunned silence that followed Elena's announcement at the community meeting was nothing compared to her husband Marcus's face as he realized the woman he'd been systematically manipulating for 8 years had just destroyed his entire criminal empire in front of 200 witnesses. Elena had spent 2 decades as a war photographer documenting corruption in the world's most dangerous places. At 52, she thought those skills were safely retired to a quiet suburban life in Colorado married to Marcus Sterling, the neighborhood's beloved financial advisor who helped families protect their life savings. But when Elena discovered that the man she trusted with her heart had been using her own home as headquarters for a multi-million-dollar fraud network, she faced a choice that would test everything she'd learned about hunting predators. The stakes couldn't be higher. Dozens of families had already lost everything, and Marcus's files revealed plans to destroy hundreds more across multiple states. Elena's investigation would either expose the most comprehensive takedown of suburban financial predation in federal history, or Marcus would complete his plan to steal her inherited home and destroy her sanity through manufactured medical emergencies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elena Vasquez Sterling had spent 22 years documenting humanity's darkest moments through her camera lens from the siege of Sarajevo to the refugee camps of Syria. At 52, she thought she'd traded war zones for wine tastings, international crises for community garden parties. She was wrong about a lot of things, but mostly about thinking her investigative instincts could ever truly be retired. The notification chimed softly on her phone as she arranged white orchids in the Waterford crystal vase her first husband had given her before his deployment to Afghanistan. Before the IED that made her a widow at 31, before she'd thrown herself into covering every conflict zone she could find before she'd met Marcus Sterling at a Denver gallery opening 8 years ago, and decided that maybe finally she deserved some peace. Bank alert, joint account transfer. $47,500. Elena stared at the screen, her fingers stilling on the flower stems. 22 years of chasing stories had taught her that the details others dismissed were often the ones that mattered most. A transfer of nearly $50,000 wasn't a detail you forgot to mention to your wife, especially when that wife had built a $2.3 million investment portfolio through decades of careful financial management. Elena, darling, have you seen my cufflinks? Marcus called from upstairs, his voice carrying that practiced warmth that had first attracted her at the gallery. She'd been exhibiting her After the Storm series, photographs from her final assignment in Syria images that had won her third Pulitzer nomination and convinced her it was time to step back from the edge she'd been walking for 2 decades. Marcus had approached her that night with genuine appreciation for her work, not the voyeuristic fascination she'd grown tired of. He understood the weight of what she'd witnessed, or at least he'd seemed to. A successful financial advisor specializing in estate planning for affluent retirees, he'd built a practice helping people secure their legacies. He was 45 to her 44, then established and stable in ways that had felt like sanctuary after years of hotel rooms and hostile territory. Check your jewelry box, she called back, deleting the bank notification and returning to her flowers. Marcus was probably moving money between investment accounts. Something to do with client portfolios or tax strategies. They'd discussed their financial division of labor early in their marriage. Elena managed her own substantial portfolio, while Marcus handled their joint household accounts and his business operations. It was a system that worked for 2 financially sophisticated adults. But as she trimmed the orchid stems, muscle memory from Syria kicked in. During her coverage of the banking crisis in Damascus, she'd learned that financial crimes always left paper trails. The question was whether you had the skill and patience to follow them. The front door opened with Marcus's distinctive pattern, 2 quick knocks followed by his key turning. A habit from his college days at Wharton, he claimed, though Elena had always suspected it was more about control than tradition. He appeared in their kitchen doorway, 6'2" and silver-haired in his tailored charcoal suit, every inch the successful financial planner who'd built his practice on trust and discretion. Stunning, he said, kissing her temple as he admired the arrangement. Sarah Chen's retirement celebration tomorrow is going to be lovely. She's so grateful you agreed to document it. Sarah Chen. The mention triggered Elena's trained memory for detail. The Chens had been Marcus's clients for 3 years, a prosperous couple in their 60s who'd worked with him on their retirement planning. David Chen had been a successful engineer. Sarah had taught high school mathematics for 35 years. Solid middle-class wealth built through decades of careful saving. "How's their portfolio performing?" Elena asked, keeping her voice casual while arranging the final flowers. Marcus paused, his hand stilling on her shoulder. It was barely perceptible, but Elena had spent years reading micro-expressions in hostile interviews. When sources were about to lie, their bodies telegraphed it first. "Oh, you know how it is with market volatility," he said, moving toward the refrigerator. "I'm helping them navigate some challenging decisions about asset allocation." Asset allocation. Elena had managed her own investments for 20 years. She knew the language. But something in Marcus's tone carried the practiced cadence of evasion she'd heard from corrupt officials and war profiteers. When people started using technical jargon to avoid answering simple questions, they usually had something to hide. That evening, as Marcus attended what he called a client emergency, the third this week, Elena sat in their home office reviewing bank statements she hadn't examined closely in months. Trust was a luxury she'd earned through financial independence. Marcus handled their day-to-day accounts while she focused on the investment portfolio that would fund their retirement and eventually pass to her daughter, Maya. But tonight, Elena approached their finances with the same systematic attention she'd once brought to investigating arms dealers and money laundering operations. The statements revealed a pattern that made her pulse quicken with recognition. Regular transfers to an account labeled Pine Haven Investment Holdings. Amounts ranging from $15,000 to $60,000, always occurring within days of Marcus's meetings with different neighbors. The timing was too consistent to be coincidental, and the amounts were too large to be routine. Mrs. Patterson, the widow, 3 houses down. A transfer of $23,000 2 days after Marcus had helped her restructure her portfolio, following her husband's death. The Rodriguez family across the street, $31,000 transferred the week after they'd consulted Marcus about early retirement due to Miguel's health issues. The Chens, $18,000 dated for tomorrow, 1 day after their retirement celebration. Elena opened her laptop and accessed the photo archive she'd maintained since moving to Pine Haven Heights. What had begun as casual documentation of their community life now looked different through the lens of financial investigation. She scrolled through 8 years of neighborhood gatherings, studying Marcus's interactions with a photographer's eye for composition and a journalist's instinct for story. There he was at community events, always gravitating toward people who looked stressed or uncertain. Marcus offering his business card to couples having quiet, intense conversations at barbecues. His expression in candid shots wasn't the warm, helpful neighbor she'd assumed she was capturing, but something more calculating. The focused attention of a predator identifying prey. A photograph from last month's neighborhood picnic stopped her completely. Marcus stood near the Henderson family's patio table, his hand on Tom Henderson's shoulder, in what appeared to be a supportive gesture. But Tom's face told a different story. The hollow-eyed expression of someone receiving devastating news while trying to maintain composure. In the background, barely visible, Tom's wife Sarah held their teenage daughter close, her knuckles white with tension. 2 weeks later, the Hendersons had put their house on the market, citing unexpected financial pressures that required immediate liquidation. They'd sold for $60,000 below assessed value to a company Elena had never heard of, Pine Haven Investment Holdings, the same entity receiving transfers from their joint account. Elena's investigative training took over completely. She accessed Colorado's public records database using techniques she'd perfected while tracking war criminals' assets across international banking systems. Within 30 minutes, she had a picture that made her hands shake with a combination of rage and professional excitement. Pine Haven Investment Holdings had purchased 11 properties in their neighborhood over the past 18 months, all from families Marcus had counseled, all for significantly below market value. All subsequently resold within 8 months for prices that reflected their actual worth, generating profits that averaged $75,000 per transaction. Marcus wasn't just helping neighbors navigate financial difficulties. He was creating those difficulties to acquire their properties at desperate sale prices. Elena closed the laptop as she heard Marcus's car in the driveway, her mind already shifting into the compartmentalized focus that had kept her alive in Syria. How many families had lost their homes because they trusted Marcus's advice? How many retirement dreams had been shattered by someone who'd positioned himself as their financial protector? Marcus entered their kitchen with the satisfied demeanor of someone whose evening had gone according to plan. "How was your emergency meeting?" Elena asked, watching his face with the attention she'd once reserved for interviewing war criminals. "Challenging situation, but we found a solution," he replied, loosening his tie. Sometimes families have to make difficult decisions about asset preservation during market downturns. Asset preservation, market downturns. Elena recognized the language of manufactured crisis, the same euphemisms used by corrupt officials who enriched themselves through others' misfortune. "Anyone I know?" she asked. Marcus paused at the refrigerator, his back to her. "Client confidentiality, you understand. But it's situations like these that make me grateful for our financial stability. Not everyone is as prepared as we are for unexpected challenges." The casual dismissal of their neighbors' struggles as unexpected challenges crystallized Elena's understanding. Marcus wasn't just stealing money. He was destroying families while positioning himself as their rescuer. It was a level of psychological manipulation that went beyond simple fraud into systematic predation. That night, Elena lay awake cataloging details she'd rationalized or dismissed over the past year. Marcus's late evening meetings, always when specific neighbors were facing crises. His suggestion that she reduce her photography work because they didn't need the additional income stress. The subtle but persistent campaign to undermine her confidence in her own professional judgment. Most disturbing was his systematic isolation of her from the financial literacy she'd spent decades developing. When Elena had questioned investment strategies or expressed concern about neighbors' rapid asset sales, Marcus had gently redirected her attention to more pleasant topics. He'd positioned her growing disengagement from financial matters as a healthy sign of their secure marriage, rather than a deliberate diminishment of her expertise. But Marcus had made a critical error in his psychological assessment. He'd assumed that Elena's transition from war photographer to suburban wife had diminished her investigative capabilities. He'd mistaken her choice to step back from conflict journalism as an inability to recognize and respond to sophisticated deception. The next morning brought the kind of crisp October day that made Colorado's mountains look like a postcard. Elena prepared her camera equipment for Sarah Chen's retirement celebration with the methodical precision of someone embarking on a dangerous assignment. Not because the suburban gathering posed physical risk, but because she was about to begin documenting evidence of a crime that had been hiding in plain sight for years. Marcus left early for what he described as a client breakfast, kissing her goodbye with the same tenderness he'd shown every morning for 8 years. "Looking forward to seeing your photos tonight," he'd said. "Sarah mentioned she wants prints for their family album." Elena smiled and nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. Because according to the financial records she'd analyzed until 3 in the morning, Sarah Chen's retirement celebration wasn't just a social gathering. It was the final stage of whatever Marcus had planned for the Chen family's financial destruction. The transfer of $18,000 to Pinehaven Investment Holdings was scheduled for tomorrow. Based on the pattern Elena had identified, that meant David and Sarah Chen were about to receive devastating financial news that would force them to liquidate their carefully planned retirement assets. Elena arrived at the Chen house an hour early, ostensibly to set up equipment, but actually to observe and document whatever was about to unfold. Sarah greeted her at the front door with the kind of forced brightness that indicated high stress barely held in check. "Elena, you're such a dear for doing this. I know it's last minute, but David insisted we needed professional documentation of—" She stopped abruptly, pressing her lips together as if catching herself before revealing too much. "Documentation of what?" Elena asked, gently adjusting her camera settings while maintaining the casual demeanor of a family friend. "Oh, you know how sentimental retirees get. David wants everything perfect for what might be our last big gathering in this house." Sarah's laugh carried no humor, only the brittle edge of someone practicing lines she didn't believe. Elena spent the next hour photographing the Chen's backyard as guests arrived, but her real focus was on documenting behavior patterns with the trained eye of someone who'd covered political corruption in a dozen countries. David Chen moved through his own retirement party like a man in shock, accepting congratulations with the distracted politeness of someone whose mind was entirely elsewhere. Marcus arrived precisely at noon carrying a leather portfolio that he immediately took to David. They disappeared into the house while Elena continued photographing guests, and Sarah continued her performance as gracious hostess, both women pretending not to notice that something significant was happening inside. When they emerged 20 minutes later, David's face had transformed. The hollow-eyed expression Elena had learned to recognize in victims of financial manipulation was now clearly visible. Marcus's hand rested on David's shoulder in a gesture that appeared supportive, but which Elena now understood as a predator's claim of ownership. "Friends, neighbors," David announced to the gathering, his voice carrying across the decorated patio with obvious effort. "Sarah and I have an announcement to make." Elena raised her camera, but she was no longer thinking about composition or lighting. She was documenting evidence capturing the moment when another family's carefully planned retirement was about to be destroyed by the man she'd married. "Due to some unexpected developments with our investment portfolio," David continued, his voice breaking slightly, "we've made the difficult decision to sell our home and downsize significantly. Recent market volatility has created a situation where we need to preserve what assets we can for our long-term security." The crowd responded with shocked silence, followed by expressions of sympathy and concern. Several neighbors immediately offered support and assistance, unaware that the man orchestrating their friend's crisis was standing among them, radiating professional competence and neighborly concern. Elena watched Marcus through her viewfinder as he worked the crowd with practiced efficiency, offering to help the Chens navigate their difficult transition, suggesting resources for emergency asset management, positioning himself as the neighborhood expert in crisis financial planning while documenting every interaction for future reference. It was psychological manipulation performed with the skill of a seasoned con artist, but Elena had interviewed enough sophisticated criminals to recognize the performance. Marcus wasn't helping his neighbors navigate financial difficulties. He was creating those difficulties to acquire their assets at distressed prices. That evening, as Marcus recounted the party with apparent sadness about the Chen's misfortune, Elena made her decision. She wouldn't confront him directly. Not yet. Instead, she would do what she'd done when facing corruption in Syria: investigate, systematically document comprehensively, and build a case so comprehensive that denial would be impossible. But first, she needed to understand the full scope of what she was dealing with. Late that night, while Marcus slept beside her with the peaceful expression of someone whose conscience was clear, Elena began the most important investigation of her career. Using skills honed through 2 decades of exposing international corruption, she systematically infiltrated her husband's digital communications and financial records. What she discovered in his private files transformed her understanding of everything they'd built together. Marcus hadn't just been manipulating neighbors into desperate asset sales. He'd been creating the crises that forced those sales through a sophisticated network of professionals who specialized in manufacturing financial emergencies. The files contained detailed psychological profiles of every affluent family in Pinehaven Heights, including vulnerability assessments, asset valuations, and strategic recommendations for exploitation. Elena's own file was among them, labeled Elena, Asset Management and Extraction Timeline. She read Marcus's clinical analysis of her character with growing horror. Subject maintains substantial independent assets, 2.3 M's portfolio, plus inherited property, 1.2. Retirement from active journalism has created opportunity for systematic confidence, undermining, and professional isolation. Recommend 18-24-month timeline for manufactured health crisis requiring asset liquidation for specialized treatment costs. Subject's daughter, Maya, medical resident Boston, represents emotional leverage point if standard approaches prove insufficient. The file included audio recordings of her private conversations, photographs taken without her knowledge, and a detailed psychological manipulation strategy designed to gradually convince her that selling her inherited home was necessary for her mental health treatment. Marcus had been systematically documenting her recovery from the trauma of war photography, looking for weaknesses he could exploit to steal the legacy she'd planned to leave her daughter. Elena closed the laptop with hands that shook with rage rather than fear. The house where she'd felt safest, the marriage she'd thought was her reward for surviving 2 decades of documenting humanity's worst impulses, had been nothing more than an elaborate long-term confidence game. But Marcus had made one critical miscalculation in his psychological assessment. He'd assumed that Elena's withdrawal from war photography indicated diminished capabilities rather than accumulated wisdom. He'd mistaken her choice to step back from international conflict as an inability to wage war when her family and community were threatened. The woman who'd survived sniper fire in Sarajevo and exposed corruption in Damascus was about to remind her husband that predators who underestimate their prey rarely survive the encounter. Elena walked to her grandmother's crystal vase, still holding the white orchids from yesterday's arrangement. In the moonlight streaming through their kitchen windows, the flowers looked ethereal and beautiful, like everything else in their carefully constructed life that was about to be revealed as an elaborate deception. Marcus stirred as she returned to bed, reaching for her in his sleep with the same tender gesture that had once made her feel cherished and protected. Now his touch felt like a violation, his unconscious affection, a reminder of how completely she'd been deceived by someone who'd studied manipulation the way she'd once studied composition and light. But lying there in the darkness, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced since her final assignment in Syria. The cold clarity that came with identifying a target and developing a strategy for complete exposure. The investigative photographer who'd exposed war crimes and financial corruption across 3 continents was about to undertake the most personal and dangerous assignment of her career. Tomorrow, she would begin systematically dismantling the criminal enterprise that had been operating under cover of suburban respectability. The quiet wife Marcus thought he'd successfully isolated and manipulated was about to become the most dangerous opponent he'd ever faced. The hunt was about to begin, and this time the predator had gravely underestimated his prey. Over the next week, Elena began her investigation with the methodical approach that had once earned her recognition from the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. She reactivated contacts she hadn't spoken to in years, accessed databases she'd almost forgotten how to navigate, and applied the systematic documentation techniques that had exposed corruption in 3 different war zones. But this investigation was different. In Syria, she'd been an outside observer documenting crimes committed by strangers. Here, she was both investigator and potential victim, documenting a conspiracy that had been operating in her own home, targeting her own community planned by the man who shared her bed. Marcus's late-night client emergencies provided perfect cover for Elena's research. While he attended what she now understood were coordination meetings with his criminal network, she systematically mapped the scope of their operation using skills that had once tracked international arms dealers and war criminals. The first breakthrough came when Elena accessed property records across Colorado and discovered that Pinehaven Investment Holdings was just one entity in a complex web of shell companies. Rocky Mountain Asset Management, Colorado Estate Solutions, Foothills Property Group. All registered to different addresses, all controlled through a maze of legal structures designed to obscure their common ownership. More disturbing was the geographic pattern. The network had operated in 5 different affluent communities over the past 7 years, moving systematically across the western United States. Aspen Meadows, Wyoming, Sun Valley Estates, Idaho, Sedona Hills, Arizona, Park City Heights, Utah. Each community had experienced a wave of unfortunate property sales that benefited the same network of shell companies before the operation moved on to fresh hunting grounds. Elena cross-referenced the timeline with Marcus's professional history and found perfect correlation. Every move in their marriage, his decision to establish his practice in each new location, their relocations for better opportunities, even their honeymoon destinations, had been calculated to research and establish operations in communities with optimal victim profiles. Their entire 8-year marriage had been a criminal enterprise disguised as domestic happiness. The second breakthrough came when Elena used her journalism credentials to access financial databases normally restricted to law enforcement and investigative reporters. The network's sophistication was breathtaking in its scope and cruelty. This wasn't just property fraud. It was systematic financial predation that targeted the most vulnerable members of affluent communities. Elena discovered files on elderly widows whose grief had been weaponized to force asset sales, military families whose PTSD and financial inexperience made them easy targets for manufactured investment crises, divorced parents whose custody concerns were manipulated to create legal expenses that required home liquidation, recent retirees whose health anxieties were exploited to justify emergency asset preservation strategies. Each victim profile read like a predator's manual for exploiting human psychology during life's most vulnerable moments. The network had perfected techniques for identifying and manipulating emotional weaknesses that would override rational financial decision-making. But Elena's most chilling discovery was evidence that Marcus wasn't working alone in Pinehaven Heights. The operation required a sophisticated support network of corrupt professionals who could manufacture the crises that forced desperate asset sales. Dr. Patricia Vance, the psychiatrist who'd been recommended to Elena for post-retirement adjustment counseling, was actually specializing in diagnosing expensive mental health conditions that required immediate residential treatment. Her patient files showed a pattern of wealthy women being diagnosed with treatment-resistant depression, requiring care that cost exactly the amount their home equity could provide. Rachel Wong, the property inspector who'd identified urgent structural issues in 7 neighborhood homes over the past year, was systematically fabricating problems that created emergency sale conditions. Her reports used technical language to describe foundation issues, electrical hazards, and environmental concerns that would terrify homeowners into immediate liquidation. Tom Bradley, the loan officer who'd helped several neighbors restructure their mortgages during financial difficulties, was actually creating those difficulties by manipulating credit ratings and introducing artificial complications into previously stable financing arrangements. The network's coordination was sophisticated enough to require professional-level planning and communication. Elena used techniques she'd learned while investigating international crime syndicates to trace their digital communications and meeting patterns. What she found made her blood run cold. Marcus's encrypted files revealed detailed strategic planning documents that read like military operation briefings, target assessment protocols for identifying vulnerable families, timeline management for coordinating multiple simultaneous extractions, risk mitigation strategies for avoiding law enforcement detection, asset liquidation procedures for maximizing profits while minimizing legal exposure. The Pinehaven Heights operation was scheduled to conclude within 6 months, after which the network would relocate to their next target community in Park City, Utah. Elena found property listings Marcus had already researched, community profiles he'd developed, and preliminary victim assessments for families whose lives would be systematically destroyed once the network established operations in their new hunting ground. But the most devastating discovery was the detailed file Marcus had compiled about Elena herself. Elena Vasquez Sterling, primary asset target, contained a psychological profile so comprehensive and clinically detached that reading it felt like examining her own autopsy report. Marcus had systematically documented every aspect of her personality, her vulnerabilities, her relationships, and her financial assets, with the clinical precision of a scientist studying a laboratory specimen. The file revealed that their entire relationship had been calculated from the beginning. Marcus hadn't met her by chance at the Denver Gallery opening 8 years ago. He'd been stalking her for months, researching her background and identifying her as a high-value target because of her substantial assets and her isolation following her traumatic final assignment in Syria. Elena found drafts of love letters Marcus had practiced, but never sent testing different emotional approaches to determine which manipulation techniques would be most effective. Detailed notes about her psychological state during her recovery from war photography, with recommendations about how to exploit her trauma to create dependency on his support. Strategic plans for isolating her from her professional networks and gradually convincing her that her investigative instincts were signs of unresolved PTSD rather than accurate threat assessment. Marcus had literally studied her the way she'd once studied corrupt officials and war criminals, looking for weaknesses that could be exploited for financial gain. The manipulation timeline was breathtakingly comprehensive. Phase 1 had involved establishing emotional dependency through apparent understanding of her professional trauma. Phase 2 had focused on isolating her from colleagues and gradually undermining her confidence in her own professional judgment. Phase 3, currently being implemented, involved manufacturing health concerns that would justify expensive treatment requiring asset liquidation. The file included recordings of her private conversations, photographs taken without her knowledge, and detailed assessments of her relationship with her daughter Maya. Marcus had identified Maya as potential emotional leverage, documenting her medical residency schedule, her student debt obligations, and her emotional dependency on Elena's approval. Most chilling was a section titled Extraction Timeline and Asset Distribution that outlined Marcus's plan for systematically stealing everything Elena had built over 2 decades of professional success. Her investment portfolio would be gradually transferred to accounts he controlled through manufactured investment opportunities. Her inherited house would be sold to cover treatment costs for a psychological condition that Dr. Vance would diagnose as requiring immediate residential care. Even her professional reputation would be destroyed through a carefully orchestrated campaign of rumors about erratic behavior and declining mental health that would make it impossible for her to return to journalism if she survived the financial extraction. Elena closed the files and walked to her home office, where walls displayed awards from 22 years of investigative journalism, Pulitzer Prize nominations, international recognition for exposing corruption and war crimes, testimonials from editors who'd trusted her with the most dangerous and important assignments of their careers. Marcus had been systematically preparing to destroy not just her financial security, but her professional legacy and her relationship with her daughter. The man who'd positioned himself as her protector from the trauma of war photography had actually been conducting psychological warfare against her more sophisticated and sustained than anything she'd experienced in actual conflict zones. But Marcus had made one critical error in his assessment of Elena's capabilities. He'd assumed that her withdrawal from war photography indicated permanent damage to her investigative skills, rather than accumulated wisdom about when and how to deploy them most effectively. The woman who'd exposed arms dealers in Bosnia and documented corruption in Damascus was about to remind her husband that predators who systematically underestimate their prey rarely survive the encounter. Elena opened her laptop and began the process that had once brought down government officials and international criminals: systematic documentation, network mapping, evidence preservation, timeline construction, strategic planning for maximum exposure with minimal personal risk. She started by creating secure digital files that would preserve all evidence even if Marcus discovered her investigation. Cloud storage systems, encrypted backups, automated distribution protocols that would ensure the evidence reached law enforcement and media contacts if anything happened to her. Next, she began reaching out to professional contacts she'd maintained, despite Marcus's subtle campaign to isolate her from her journalism network. Detective Lisa Park of the Denver Police Department, who'd worked with Elena on a corruption investigation 5 years earlier. Special Agent Sarah Chen of the FBI's White Collar Crime Division, who'd consulted with Elena about international money laundering techniques. David Chen, no relation to Agent Chen, an investigative journalist with the Denver Post who specialized in financial crime stories. Each contact represented a potential ally in building a case strong enough to destroy Marcus's network while protecting Elena from retaliation. But reaching out required careful communication that wouldn't alert Marcus to her investigation if he was monitoring her activities. Elena used tradecraft she'd learned while protecting sources in hostile environments, secure phone applications that encrypted communications, meeting protocols that avoided surveillance, information sharing techniques that preserved operational security while building comprehensive intelligence about her targets. The investigation was complicated by the intimate nature of her relationship with the primary target. Elena had to continue performing the role of unsuspecting wife while systematically gathering evidence that would destroy her marriage and potentially send her husband to federal prison. It required compartmentalization skills that even her war photography experience hadn't fully prepared her for. But Elena had advantages that Marcus couldn't have anticipated: 22 years of professional experience investigating sophisticated criminals, financial independence that made her immune to economic manipulation, a professional network that included law enforcement and media contacts who could ensure that evidence was preserved and properly investigated. Most importantly, Elena understood something that Marcus had never grasped. Despite his sophisticated manipulation techniques, the difference between being victimized and being defeated. Marcus had spent months positioning her as his victim, but he'd been preparing her to become his nemesis. 3 weeks into her investigation, Elena had compiled evidence of a criminal conspiracy that extended across multiple states and involved dozens of professionals in what appeared to be the most sophisticated suburban financial predation scheme in federal law enforcement history. Property fraud, elder abuse, medical fraud, psychological manipulation, and systematic community infiltration on a scale that would require federal prosecution under RICO statutes. But evidence alone wouldn't be sufficient to destroy Marcus's network. Elena needed to document their methods in real time, creating irrefutable proof of their criminal intent, while protecting herself and other potential victims from retaliation. The opportunity came when Elena discovered that Marcus was preparing to implement the next phase of her extraction timeline. Dr. Vance had scheduled Elena for comprehensive psychological evaluation that would support a diagnosis requiring immediate residential treatment. The cost of treatment would necessitate liquidating Elena's investment portfolio, and selling her inherited house to a buyer that Elena now knew would be controlled by Marcus's network. Elena made her decision with the cold calculation that had once guided her through sniper-controlled neighborhoods and hostile government checkpoints. She would allow Marcus to begin implementing his scheme while secretly documenting every step building toward a confrontation that would expose not just Marcus but his entire criminal enterprise. The war photographer who'd survived Syria and Bosnia was about to undertake the most dangerous assignment of her career, hunting a predator who'd been systematically preparing to destroy her, while believing he controlled every aspect of the battlefield. Marcus had spent 8 years studying Elena's weaknesses and vulnerabilities, preparing to exploit them for financial gain. But he'd never bothered to study her strengths or understand the difference between choosing peace and losing the ability to wage war when necessary. Elena walked to her bedroom window and looked out at the Pine Haven Heights community, where Marcus had been systematically destroying families for 2 years. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of turning his own methods against him, using his network's sophistication and documentation against them in ways they'd never anticipated. The hunt was about to begin, and the predator who'd been preparing to destroy Elena Vasquez Sterling was about to discover that he'd been sharing his home and his secrets with one of the most dangerous investigative journalists of her generation. In the morning, she would begin systematically dismantling everything Marcus had built, while he continued believing he was in control of their relationship and her future. The quiet suburban wife he thought he'd successfully manipulated was about to become the architect of his complete destruction. The skills that had exposed war criminals and international corruption were about to be focused on the most personal target of Elena's career. And this time, there would be no place for the predator to hide. Elena's first call went to Detective Lisa Park at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, early enough to catch her before shift briefing, but late enough to avoid appearing desperate. 22 years of cultivating sources had taught Elena that timing mattered almost as much as information when building cases that could withstand legal scrutiny. Elena Vasquez. Lisa said, her voice carrying the sharp attention of someone who remembered working with a photographer whose instincts had once saved her career. I wondered if I'd hear from you again. Thought you'd retired to domestic bliss in the suburbs. It's Elena Sterling now, Elena replied carefully. And I need your help with something that's going to sound impossible until you see the evidence. They met at a coffee shop in downtown Denver, far enough from Pine Haven Heights to avoid any possibility of surveillance by Marcus's network. Elena had chosen the location with the same tactical awareness she'd once used for meetings with sources in hostile territory. Multiple exit routes, clear sightlines, and enough ambient noise to defeat basic audio surveillance. Lisa arrived early as Elena had expected. Good investigators developed habits that kept them alive and effective. When Elena showed her the initial evidence she'd compiled, financial records, property transfers, victim timelines across multiple states, Lisa's expression shifted from professional courtesy to intense focus. This is federal, Lisa said, immediately studying the documents with the practiced eye of someone who'd built cases against sophisticated criminal enterprises. The interstate nature, the coordination, the financial scope, this needs to go to the FBI's white-collar crime division. I was hoping you'd say that, Elena replied. I need people who can handle evidence properly and provide protection for witnesses when this becomes public. Lisa made the introduction to Special Agent Sarah Chen that afternoon. Agent Chen specialized in complex financial fraud cases involving multiple jurisdictions, exactly the kind of prosecutor Elena needed for a case that would span 7 years and 5 states. Miss Ms. Sterling, Agent Chen said during their first meeting, reviewing Elena's preliminary evidence with obvious appreciation for its thoroughness. What you've uncovered here is extraordinary, but it's also extremely dangerous. These people have been operating for years without detection, which means they're sophisticated, careful, and potentially violent if cornered. Elena had considered the risks with the same analytical approach she'd once used to assess dangerous assignments in conflict zones. Agent Chen, I understand what I'm facing, but I'm also in a unique position to gather evidence that could stop them permanently. My husband trusts me completely because he believes his psychological manipulation has been successful. Agent Chen reviewed Marcus's timeline for Elena's extraction and confirmed Elena's assessment about escalation. According to the documents Elena had provided, the fake health crisis was scheduled to begin within 2 weeks, triggered by what would appear to be a series of medical emergencies requiring expensive specialized treatment. "We need you to let them proceed with their plan while we build our case," Agent Chen explained. "But we'll be monitoring everything through surveillance equipment we provide, and we'll have safeguards in place to prevent any actual harm. The goal is to document their criminal conspiracy in real time, creating evidence that will be impossible to challenge in court." Elena agreed to work as a confidential informant, but she insisted on maintaining operational control over the investigation timeline. 22 years of independent journalism had taught her that the best stories came from reporters who understood their subjects better than their sources understood themselves. Over the following week, Elena implemented a surveillance operation that would have impressed her former colleagues at the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. Every room in her house was equipped with FBI-provided recording equipment so sophisticated it could capture conversations through walls. Her phone was configured to automatically upload all communications to secure federal servers. She wore jewelry that contained miniature cameras capable of recording high-definition video with timestamp authentication. But the technical surveillance was only part of Elena's strategy. She also had to document Marcus's psychological manipulation techniques in ways that would help federal prosecutors explain to a jury how intelligent, successful people could be convinced to make decisions that seemed obviously destructive in retrospect. The process required Elena to become a double agent in her own marriage, appearing to succumb to Marcus's manipulation, while actually controlling every aspect of their interactions. It was the most psychologically demanding assignment of her career, requiring her to portray vulnerability while maintaining the mental strength necessary to document everything with professional precision. Marcus's implementation of Phase 3 began exactly according to his timeline, with symptoms that developed gradually over several days. Headaches that seemed unusually persistent despite over-the-counter medication. Vision problems that made photography difficult and created anxiety about her professional capabilities. Memory issues that affected her ability to manage routine tasks and created doubt about her mental acuity. Elena knew the symptoms were artificially induced. Her investigation had revealed that Dr. Vance had been providing Marcus with mild neurotoxins that could be administered through supplements or food additives. The dosages were carefully calculated to create concerning symptoms without causing permanent damage, providing medical justification for expensive testing and treatment that would create financial pressure. But Elena had to convincingly portray someone who was genuinely frightened about her health while secretly documenting the entire medical fraud. She visited Dr. Vance for consultations that were recorded by devices hidden in her clothing, capturing evidence of deliberate misdiagnosis and recommendations for unnecessary treatments designed to drain her assets. "Elena, I'm concerned about the combination of symptoms you're experiencing," Dr. Vance said during one consultation, her voice carrying exactly the right tone of professional worry mixed with urgency. The headaches, vision problems, and memory issues could indicate several serious neurological conditions that require immediate investigation. She recommended a series of expensive tests at specialized facilities that weren't covered by standard insurance policies, creating the financial emergency that Marcus would use to justify desperate asset liquidation measures. The estimated cost was nearly $60,000, money Elena supposedly didn't have in liquid accounts, but could easily obtain by selling her inherited house or liquidating her investment portfolio. "I know this is frightening," Dr. Vance continued, "but early detection is crucial for effective treatment. Sometimes families have to make difficult financial decisions to prioritize health over other considerations. Your husband mentioned that you have significant assets that could be liquidated if necessary for specialized care." Elena agreed to the testing while knowing that Agent Chen's team was monitoring Drs. Vance's communications and documenting her coordination with Marcus about timing and financial pressure. Every conversation was being preserved as evidence, every fraudulent recommendation was being recorded for federal prosecution. As the financial pressure mounted according to Marcus's timeline, his psychological manipulation became more intensive and sophisticated. He presented himself as the strong partner willing to sacrifice anything for Elena's health, while subtly introducing ideas about asset liquidation that would supposedly preserve their long-term financial security. "Elena, I've been thinking about our options," he said one evening as they reviewed the mounting medical bills, his voice carrying exactly the right mixture of concern and pragmatic problem-solving. "I know how much the house means to you, but we need to consider what's really important here. Your health has to come first, and if liquidating some assets means getting you the best possible treatment, He left the sentence unfinished, allowing Elena to complete the thought herself in a way that would make the decision feel like her own choice, rather than his manipulation. It was a technique Elena recognized from her coverage of cult leaders and authoritarian politicians, creating the illusion of autonomous decision-making while actually controlling every aspect of the process. But Elena was recording everything, documenting not just Marcus's words, but his tone, his body language, and the careful timing of his suggestions. She was building a comprehensive record of psychological manipulation that would help prosecutors demonstrate to a jury how sophisticated predators could convince rational people to make decisions that served the manipulator's interests rather than their own. "I don't know," Elena replied, allowing genuine anguish to color her voice. The anguish was real, not about losing assets, but about understanding how thoroughly the man she'd loved had been deceiving her for 8 years. "That house is all I have left of my family. It's Maya's inheritance." "I understand," Marcus said, taking her hands in his with the gentle pressure that had once comforted her through nightmares about Syria. "But your family would want you to be healthy and safe. Maya would rather have her mother alive and well than inherit a house from someone who didn't get the medical care she needed." The manipulation was flawless, using Elena's love for her daughter to justify stealing the legacy she'd planned to leave her. It was emotional extortion disguised as loving support, and if Elena hadn't understood what Marcus was doing, she might have been convinced by the apparent sincerity of his concern. Through the surveillance equipment Agent Chen had provided, Elena was able to record Marcus's private communications with his network coordinators. These conversations revealed the sophisticated level of planning that went into each manipulation campaign and confirmed that Elena's case was part of a much larger criminal enterprise. "Elena is responding exactly as predicted," Marcus reported during one call with Rachel Wong, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose professional expertise was being validated. "The medical pressure is creating the financial anxiety we anticipated, and she's beginning to consider asset liquidation as a viable option rather than fighting the diagnosis." "What about timeline?" Rachel asked. "We need to coordinate the property assessment with Tom's financing complications. If the timing is off, she might have alternatives to quick liquidation." "Dr. Vance estimates another 2 weeks before Elena reaches decision point," Marcus replied. "That gives us time to arrange the emergency assessment and prepare the quick sale documentation." The beauty of this extraction is that Elena actually wants to preserve assets for her daughter, so she'll be motivated to accept below-market offers if we position them as protecting Maya's long-term inheritance. They discussed Elena's psychological state with clinical detachment, analyzing her responses to manufactured stress, and planning adjustments to their manipulation strategy based on her behavior patterns. It was like listening to scientists discussing a laboratory experiment, except the subject was Elena's life, and the goal was stealing everything her family had worked to build. But every word was being recorded by federal surveillance equipment, creating evidence that would be impossible to challenge in court. Agent Chen's team was building a comprehensive case that would ensure conviction on multiple federal charges, including elder abuse, medical fraud, wire fraud, and racketeering. Elena's investigation expanded beyond her own case as she used her access to Marcus's files to identify and contact previous victims across multiple states. Each family represented additional evidence and testimony that would strengthen the federal case while demonstrating the systematic nature of the network's criminal enterprise. The Henderson family from Aspen Meadows, Wyoming, agreed to provide testimony once they understood that their unfortunate investment losses had actually been coordinated financial manipulation designed to force the sale of their vacation property. Rebecca Walsh, a 78-year-old widow from Sun Valley Estates, Idaho, became a key witness who could describe the psychological manipulation techniques used against elderly victims whose grief had been weaponized for financial exploitation. The Rodriguez family from Sedona Hills, Arizona, provided evidence about how immigration concerns had been manipulated to prevent them from seeking legal protection when their mortgage became problematic due to documentation issues that Tom Bradley had artificially created through his network of corrupt banking contacts. Each victim Elena contacted added another layer to the comprehensive case being built, creating a record of systematic predation that would be impossible for any jury to dismiss as coincidental misfortune or legitimate business practices. But Elena's most dangerous discovery came when she accessed communications between Marcus and contacts in Park City, Utah, their planned next location after completing the Pine Haven Heights operation. The network had already begun researching potential victims and establishing the professional relationships necessary to implement their scheme in a new community. Property records showed that Marcus had purchased a house in Park City under a shell company name. Business registration documents revealed that he'd established a financial planning practice and was already networking with affluent retirees who would become his next targets. Preliminary victim assessments identified vulnerable families whose assets and psychological profiles made them optimal candidates for systematic financial extraction. The Park City files contained over 40 potential victim profiles, representing an estimated $15 million in assets that would be stolen through manufactured crises and psychological manipulation over the following 2 years. Elena was looking at evidence of planned crimes that would destroy dozens of families if the network wasn't stopped immediately. Elena shared this intelligence with Agent Chen, who coordinated with federal authorities in Utah to begin monitoring the Park City operation while building the case against the Pinehaven Heights network. The scope of the investigation expanded to include multiple field offices and required coordination with state law enforcement agencies across 5 jurisdictions. Elena, what you've accomplished here goes far beyond exposing your husband's crimes, Agent Chen told her during one of their secure briefings. You've uncovered a criminal enterprise that represents one of the most sophisticated financial predation schemes we've ever documented. Your evidence is going to be the foundation for prosecutions that could prevent hundreds of families from being victimized. But Elena's investigation also revealed something that made her blood run cold: evidence that Marcus's network had been monitoring her activities and was beginning to suspect that their Elena extraction wasn't proceeding according to plan. Intercepted communications between Dr. Vance and Marcus showed growing concern about Elena's unexpected resilience to the psychological manipulation techniques that had been successful with previous victims. Elena's requests for second medical opinions and her careful documentation of symptoms suggested to them that she might be more sophisticated about medical fraud than they'd anticipated. Subjects showing signs of investigative behavior rather than victim compliance. Dr. Vance reported in one communication, recommend accelerating timeline and implementing contingency protocols for non-cooperative extraction scenarios. Elena realized that Marcus was preparing to escalate from psychological manipulation to more direct methods of asset extraction. If she didn't comply voluntarily with the manufactured medical crisis, the network was prepared to use legal guardianship proceedings, involuntary psychiatric commitment, or other coercive measures to gain control of her assets. The investigation had reached a critical decision point. Elena could continue gathering evidence while risking exposure and potential retaliation, or she could work with federal authorities to spring the trap before Marcus's network could adapt to her resistance. Elena made her choice with the same calculated risk assessment that had guided her through hostile assignments in 3 different war zones. She would let Marcus believe his escalated tactics were working, while Agent Chen's team prepared for coordinated arrests that would destroy the entire network simultaneously. The war photographer who'd survived government assassination attempts and international corruption investigations was about to undertake the most dangerous phase of her most personal assignment. Marcus's network was sophisticated and careful, but they'd made one critical error. They'd chosen to target someone who'd spent 22 years hunting predators in environments far more dangerous than suburban Colorado. Elena's final surveillance mission would document Marcus's network in the act of implementing their contingency protocols for non-cooperative extraction scenarios. She would appear to succumb to their escalated pressure while actually controlling every aspect of the confrontation that would destroy them. The predators who'd been systematically hunting vulnerable families were about to discover that they'd been sharing their plans and their homes with someone far more dangerous than anyone they'd ever encountered. Elena Vasquez Sterling was ready to remind them that the most deadly opponents are often the ones who've been underestimated by people who mistake survival skills for weakness. The hunt was reaching its climax, and this time the predators would become the prey. As Elena prepared for the final phase of her investigation, she reflected on the journey that had transformed her from victim to hunter. Marcus had spent 8 years systematically studying her weaknesses, but he'd never bothered to understand her strengths or anticipate what would happen when those strengths were focused on destroying him. Tomorrow, she would begin the process that would expose not just Marcus, but his entire criminal enterprise, protecting hundreds of potential victims while ensuring that the sophisticated predators who'd been hiding behind suburban respectability would face the full weight of federal justice. The woman Marcus had targeted for extraction was about to extract everything he'd built from him using his own methods and documentation to ensure that his destruction was as thorough and permanent as the devastation he'd planned for her. Rachel Wong's fake property inspection was scheduled to coincide with the peak of Elena's manufactured health crisis, creating a perfect storm of financial pressure that would force rapid decision-making. She arrived at Elena's house on a gray December morning, carrying professional equipment and projecting the competent authority that had convinced dozens of families to trust her assessments over the past 7 years. "Mrs. Sterling, your husband asked me to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of your property's condition," Rachel explained, setting up moisture meters and structural analysis equipment in Elena's foyer. "Given your current medical situation, it's important to understand exactly what assets you're working with from a financial perspective." Elena knew the inspection was designed to discover expensive structural problems that would reduce the house's value and create urgency about selling before the issues became more costly to address. But she was documenting everything wearing FBI-provided recording devices that captured not just Rachel's words, but also her deliberate creation of false evidence. Elena watched Rachel plant moisture indicators in the basement that would suggest water damage requiring immediate attention. She recorded Rachel photographing minor cosmetic issues from angles that made them appear more serious than they actually were. She documented Rachel's creation of false measurements that would support claims about foundation problems that didn't exist. "I'm finding some concerning issues," Rachel announced after several hours of fabricated investigation, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd perfected this performance through years of repetition. "The moisture levels in your basement suggest ongoing water intrusion that could lead to serious structural damage if not addressed immediately." She showed Elena photographs that appeared to document serious problems, but Elena knew they'd been staged using techniques that would be obvious to any legitimate inspector. The evidence would help federal prosecutors prove not just fraud, but also Rachel's specific methods of creating false assessments that had been used to victimize dozens of families. The cost of addressing these issues could be substantial. Rachel continued consulting her tablet with the focused attention of someone delivering carefully rehearsed lines. $30,000 to $40,000 minimum, possibly much more if the damage extends to areas we can't easily access. In many cases, families in your situation find that selling quickly, even at a reduced price, is more financially sound than investing in expensive repairs with uncertain outcomes. It was the same script Rachel had used on dozens of other families, refined through years of practice into a presentation that appeared objective, while actually steering victims toward predetermined conclusions that would benefit Marcus's network. Elena appeared appropriately distressed by the news while internally calculating how much additional evidence this single interaction would provide for the federal case. Rachel's systematic fraud, when combined with Marcus's psychological manipulation and Dr. Vance's medical fraud, would support racketeering charges that could result in decades of federal prison time. As the manufactured crisis reached its planned crescendo, Elena had to maintain her performance as an increasingly desperate victim while Agent Chen's team prepared for the coordinated takedown that would destroy Marcus's entire network. The psychological strain was unlike anything Elena had experienced during 22 years of conflict journalism. In Syria, she'd faced physical danger from hostile forces who were clearly identified as enemies. Here, she was conducting psychological warfare against someone who shared her bed, who'd manipulated her emotions and exploited her love for 8 years, who was systematically preparing to destroy her while believing he was protecting their marriage. Elena found herself compartmentalizing emotions and responses in ways that even her war photography experience hadn't fully prepared her for. She had to maintain genuine affection for the man she'd married while building a case that would send him to federal prison. She had to appear vulnerable and dependent while actually controlling every aspect of their interactions. She had to portray confusion and fear while maintaining perfect clarity about the investigation's timeline and objectives. The personal cost became apparent when Elena realized how thoroughly Marcus's manipulation had affected her relationship with her daughter Maya. During their weekly video calls, Elena found herself analyzing every conversation for signs that Marcus had been manipulating her communications with her own child. "Mom, you sound stressed," Maya observed during one call, her medical training making her sensitive to subtle changes in vocal patterns and emotional presentation. "Are you taking care of yourself? Marcus mentioned you've been having some health concerns." Marcus mentioned. Elena realized that he'd been having separate conversations with Maya, positioning himself as the concerned stepfather, worried about Elena's declining mental health. It was a sophisticated strategy for isolating Elena from her primary emotional support, while building a foundation for legal guardianship proceedings if voluntary asset liquidation didn't proceed according to schedule. I'm managing some challenges. Elena replied carefully, knowing that Marcus might be monitoring their conversation and that anything she said could be used to support Dr. Vance's diagnosis of psychological instability. But I'm getting good medical care and working through things systematically. After the call, Elena reviewed 8 years of communications between Marcus and Maya, using digital forensics techniques she'd learned while investigating international cybercrime. What she discovered made her feel physically sick. Marcus had been grooming Maya's perception of Elena's mental state for over 2 years, subtly introducing concerns about Elena's adjustment to retirement and her ongoing recovery from war trauma. He'd positioned himself as Elena's primary caregiver and emotional support, while gradually suggesting that Elena's investigative instincts and natural skepticism were signs of unresolved PTSD that affected her judgment and decision-making capabilities. Maya's own responses showed how effective Marcus's manipulation had been. She'd gradually become more protective of Marcus's concerns about Elena, more willing to defer to his assessment of Elena's psychological state, and more supportive of suggestions that Elena needed additional medical care and reduced decision-making responsibilities. Elena realized that if Marcus's plan had succeeded, Maya would have supported the asset liquidation and psychiatric treatment as necessary interventions for her mother's declining mental health. Marcus had been systematically poisoning Elena's relationship with her own daughter as part of his long-term extraction strategy. The discovery strengthened Elena's resolve, but also highlighted the personal stakes of her investigation. This wasn't just about protecting her own assets or stopping Marcus's criminal network. It was about preserving her relationship with Maya and preventing the complete destruction of everything Elena had built over 2 decades of professional success. Elena's investigation also revealed the broader community impact of Marcus's operations. Through careful analysis of property records and victim interviews, she documented how the network's activities had destroyed the social fabric of multiple communities while generating enormous profits for the criminal enterprise. In Aspen, Meadows, Wyoming, the network's extraction of 11 families had triggered a cascade of economic disruption that affected local businesses, schools, and community organizations. Property values had declined due to the artificially high number of distressed sales. Local businesses had lost customers when families were forced to relocate suddenly. Community organizations had lost volunteers and donors when their most active members became victims of systematic financial manipulation. The pattern repeated across every community where Marcus's network had operated. The criminals weren't just stealing individual assets. They were systematically destabilizing entire communities while extracting maximum profit from human suffering. Elena's documentation of these broader impacts would help federal prosecutors demonstrate that Marcus's network represented a criminal enterprise that caused widespread harm, extending far beyond their immediate victims. The evidence would support enhanced sentencing under federal guidelines for crimes that affected multiple communities and demonstrated sophisticated criminal planning. But Elena's investigation also uncovered evidence that Marcus's network was beginning to suspect that their Elena extraction wasn't proceeding according to plan. Intercepted communications showed growing concern about Elena's unexpected resilience and non-standard victim responses to their manipulation techniques. Subject showing signs of investigative behavior rather than victim compliance, Dr. Vance reported in one communication with Marcus. Requests for second opinions, documentation of symptoms, questions about treatment protocols. Recommend implementing contingency procedures for resistant extraction scenarios. Elena realized that Marcus was preparing to escalate from psychological manipulation to more coercive methods of asset control. The network's contingency protocols included legal guardianship proceedings based on manufactured evidence of mental incapacity, involuntary psychiatric commitment through corrupted medical professionals, and emergency asset protection measures that would transfer Elena's wealth to accounts controlled by Marcus's shell companies. Agent Chen confirmed Elena's assessment during one of their secure briefings. Your husband's network has used these escalation techniques in other cases where victims didn't respond to standard manipulation, she explained. We've documented at least 3 instances where they successfully gained legal control of victims' assets through fraudulent guardianship proceedings. The investigation had reached a critical decision point. Elena could continue gathering evidence while risking exposure and potential escalation to coercive asset extraction, or she could work with federal authorities to spring the trap before Marcus's network could adapt their tactics to her resistance. Elena made her choice with the same calculated risk assessment that had guided her through hostile assignments in international conflict zones. She would let Marcus believe his escalation tactics were succeeding, while Agent Chen's team prepared for coordinated arrests that would destroy the entire network simultaneously. The decision required Elena to appear increasingly vulnerable to Marcus's escalated manipulation while actually maintaining perfect control over the investigation timeline. She had to convince Marcus that his contingency protocols were breaking down her resistance without actually giving him any real power over her assets or legal status. Elena's performance during this final phase drew on every technique she'd learned for maintaining cover while operating in hostile territory. She appeared to accept Dr. Vance's diagnosis while secretly recording evidence of medical fraud. She seemed to consider Marcus's suggestions about asset liquidation while actually coordinating with FBI agents to document his criminal intent. She portrayed growing desperation about her health situation while precisely controlling every aspect of the investigation's progression. The psychological demands were extraordinary, but Elena had spent 2 decades learning how to compartmentalize emotions and maintain operational focus under extreme stress. The skills that had kept her alive while documenting war crimes and government corruption were now protecting her, while she documented the most personal betrayal of her life. Marcus's escalation included increasing the dosage of neurotoxins that Dr. Vance was providing, creating more severe symptoms that would justify more urgent medical intervention. Elena had to endure genuinely frightening neurological effects while maintaining her investigation and avoiding any real harm to her long-term health. FBI medical consultants monitored Elena's condition through regular covert examinations, ensuring that the investigation didn't compromise her actual well-being while documenting the sophisticated medical fraud being committed against her. The federal case now included evidence of assault through deliberate poisoning, adding additional serious charges to the eventual prosecution. Elena's final week of evidence gathering focused on documenting Marcus's coordination with corrupt professionals in Park City, Utah, where the network planned to relocate after completing their Pine Haven Heights operations. She recorded conversations about victim identification, asset assessment, and timeline planning for criminal operations that would destroy dozens of families if not prevented through federal intervention. The Park City evidence demonstrated the interstate scope of Marcus's criminal enterprise and provided federal prosecutors with grounds for enhanced penalties under federal racketeering statutes. Elena's investigation had evolved from documenting her own victimization to exposing a sophisticated criminal network that represented one of the most comprehensive financial predation schemes in federal law enforcement history. Agent Chen's team coordinated with field offices in Utah, Wyoming, Idaho, and Arizona to prepare simultaneous arrests that would prevent any network members from escaping or destroying evidence when the operation was exposed. The scope of the investigation required coordination with multiple federal agencies and state law enforcement organizations across 5 jurisdictions. Elena's evidence would serve as the foundation for federal prosecutions that could result in life sentences for the network's leadership and substantial prison terms for all participants. The comprehensive nature of her documentation would prevent any possibility of plea bargains or reduced charges that might allow the criminals to resume their operations after brief prison terms. But most importantly, Elena's investigation would protect hundreds of potential victims who would have been targeted by Marcus's network over the following years. The Park City victim profiles alone represented over 40 families whose lives would have been destroyed if the criminal enterprise hadn't been stopped. As Elena prepared for the final confrontation that would expose Marcus's network, she reflected on the personal transformation that had occurred during 3 months of the most intensive investigation of her career. The woman who'd believed her investigative skills were part of a past life had rediscovered capabilities that surpassed anything she'd accomplished during her journalism career. Elena had spent 22 years documenting crimes committed by strangers in distant countries. This investigation had required her to maintain perfect operational security while living with her target to gather evidence while being systematically betrayed by someone she loved, and to build a federal case while protecting herself from psychological and physical harm. The skills were the same, but the stakes were personal in ways that made every discovery more urgent and every decision more consequential. Elena's investigation hadn't just exposed criminal activity. It had revealed the true nature of the man she'd shared her life with and the sophisticated manipulation techniques he'd used to exploit her love and trust. Tomorrow, Elena would implement the final phase of an investigation that would destroy Marcus's criminal empire, while ensuring that the predators who'd been systematically hunting vulnerable families would face the full consequences of their crimes. The war photographer who'd survived government assassination attempts and international corruption investigations was ready to conclude the most dangerous and personal assignment of her career. The woman Marcus had targeted for financial extraction was about to extract everything he'd built using his own documentation and methods to ensure that his destruction was as thorough and permanent as the devastation he'd planned for her and dozens of other families. The hunt was reaching its climax, and the predator who'd systematically underestimated his prey was about to learn the difference between being a sophisticated criminal and facing someone who'd spent decades hunting sophisticated criminals in environments far more dangerous than suburban Colorado. The December morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made Colorado's mountains look like a postcard. But Elena Vasquez Sterling felt the weight of 3 months' investigation pressing against her chest as she prepared for what would be Marcus's final day as a free man. She stood in their kitchen, the same space where she'd first discovered the bank notification that had unraveled 8 years of lies. Reviewing the final coordination timeline on her secure phone, while Marcus showered upstairs, completely unaware that his wife had spent the weekend coordinating with federal agents, local media outlets, and victim advocates who would ensure his destruction was both comprehensive and permanent. The Pine Haven Heights annual community meeting had been Marcus's idea, of course. 6 months ago, he'd volunteered to coordinate what he'd described to the neighborhood association as an investment opportunity presentation that would help residents navigate challenging economic conditions. Elena now understood that Marcus had planned this gathering as his final victim identification session before the network relocated to Park City, Utah, where 43 families had already been researched and profiled for systematic financial destruction. Instead, tonight's meeting would become the most comprehensive takedown of suburban financial predation in federal law enforcement history. Elena's reflection in the kitchen window showed a woman who had been fundamentally transformed over the past 3 months. Gone was the quietly supportive suburban wife who had deferred to Marcus's expertise. In her place stood someone who had reclaimed 22 years of investigative experience and focused those skills on the most personal and dangerous assignment of her career. The transformation hadn't been easy. Every day had required her to appear vulnerable while actually controlling every aspect of their relationship to portray confusion, while maintaining perfect clarity about the investigation's progression, to endure systematic psychological manipulation, while documenting evidence that would destroy the man she'd once loved. But tonight, the performance would end. "Elena, darling, have you seen my presentation remote?" Marcus called from upstairs, his voice carrying the confident anticipation of someone whose carefully planned operation was about to reach its successful conclusion. He had no idea that the presentation remote Elena would hand him had been modified by FBI technical specialists to ensure that his slides would never appear on the community center's projection screens. "On your desk next to your cufflinks," Elena called back, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. After 3 months of playing the role of manipulated victim, she was ready to reveal who she'd actually been all along. Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway 15 minutes later, impeccably dressed in his navy blazer and khakis, the uniform of suburban authority that had made him trusted by affluent families across 5 states. He carried a leather portfolio containing what he believed were victim identification materials that would guide his selection of final targets before the network's relocation. Elena knew the portfolio actually contained evidence of criminal conspiracy that would support federal racketeering charges carrying potential life sentences. "Big night," Marcus said, kissing Elena's forehead with the casual affection that had once made her feel cherished and protected. Now his touch felt like a predator marking territory. But Elena accepted the gesture with the same grace she'd maintained throughout 3 months of systematic deception. "Your neighbors are lucky to have someone who cares so much about their financial security." Elena replied the words carrying irony that Marcus was too confident to detect. He had no idea that his wife had spent the past week coordinating with victims from 4 different states who would be present tonight to witness his destruction. The drive to the community center gave Elena time for final mental preparation. She'd spent 2 decades documenting the exposure of sophisticated criminals in international settings. But this investigation had required skills she'd never fully developed the ability to maintain perfect operational security while living with her target to gather evidence while being systematically betrayed by someone she loved, and to build a federal case while protecting herself from both psychological manipulation and potential physical harm. Tonight would test everything she'd learned about timing evidence presentation and psychological warfare against opponents who believed they controlled every aspect of the battlefield. The Pinehaven Heights Community Center had been transformed into what appeared to be a typical neighborhood gathering, complete with seasonal decorations and folding chairs arranged in neat rows facing a small stage. What the arriving families didn't realize was that every corner of the venue had been equipped with professional recording equipment that several community members were actually federal agents, and that the evening's entertainment would include the most devastating revelation in their neighborhood's history. Elena arrived 90 minutes early, carrying what appeared to be photography equipment, but was actually a sophisticated surveillance and broadcasting system that would allow her to override the venue's presentation technology. She moved through the space with tactical awareness, learned during coverage of government takedowns in hostile territory, checking sightlines and communication points while appearing to focus on lighting and camera positioning. Agent Sarah Chen's voice crackled through Elena's concealed earpiece as she tested the projection override system that would transform Marcus's victim identification presentation into evidence of his criminal enterprise. All units in position. We have confirmation that Sterling and his primary network associates are en route. Remember, we need him to begin his presentation and commit to his victim selection process before we reveal the evidence. The more witnesses present for his response to the accusations, the stronger our psychological impact and legal case become. Elena had insisted on controlling the timing of the revelation herself. 22 years of investigative journalism had taught her that exposing sophisticated criminals required perfect coordination between evidence presentation and psychological pressure. Marcus needed to be completely committed to his criminal intent before discovering that his intended victims had become his judges. The community center filled steadily as families arrived for what they believed would be helpful guidance about protecting their financial security during uncertain economic times. Elena recognized faces from Marcus's target assessment files. Recent retirees with substantial home equity and limited family support, elderly widows whose grief made them vulnerable to emotional manipulation, families dealing with medical expenses that could be exploited to create artificial financial pressure. But Elena also recognized faces that Marcus hadn't expected: previous victims who had traveled from Wyoming, Idaho, and Arizona to witness the exposure of the man who had destroyed their financial security, while convincing them he was providing expert guidance during difficult times. Tom and Sarah Henderson sat in the third row, having driven from Casper, Wyoming, where they'd been forced to relocate after losing their home to Marcus's manufactured foundation crisis. Rebecca Walsh had flown in from Boise, Idaho, where she now lived in a senior housing facility after being manipulated into selling the house she'd shared with her deceased husband for 40 years. The Rodriguez family had brought their teenage children from Phoenix, Arizona, wanting them to witness justice for the man who had exploited their immigration concerns to steal their family's savings. Each victim family represented evidence that would demonstrate the interstate scope of Marcus's criminal enterprise and support federal racketeering charges that could result in life sentences for the network's leadership. Marcus arrived precisely on schedule, projecting the confident authority that had made him trusted by affluent communities across the western United States. He moved through the crowd with practiced charm, greeting neighbors and making subtle assessments of their financial stress levels that would guide his victim selection process. Elena watched him through her camera lens, documenting his predatory behavior one final time, while coordinating final positioning with federal agents positioned throughout the venue. He's proceeding according to established patterns, Elena reported quietly into her concealed microphone while appearing to adjust camera settings. Currently engaging with the Williamson family, recent retirees with substantial assets and limited local family support. Also spending extended time with the Martinez couple who mentioned healthcare cost concerns during pre-event conversations. Elena had learned to read Marcus's hunting behavior over 3 months of intimate observation. He gravitated toward people who showed signs of anxiety or uncertainty, who mentioned financial concerns in casual conversation, who appeared isolated from extended family networks that might provide alternative guidance during crisis situations. Agent Chen's response carried the tension of someone coordinating a complex operation with multiple moving parts. Understood. All surveillance teams confirm ready status. Media coordination complete. We'll have comprehensive coverage that ensures this story reaches national attention. Remember, timing is critical. We need maximum witness impact before any network members can escape or destroy evidence. Elena understood the broader implications of tonight's operation. This wasn't just about exposing Marcus's crimes against their immediate community. The Pine Haven Heights takedown was designed to demonstrate how sophisticated financial predation networks operated and to provide a template for communities across the country to recognize and respond to similar threats. At 7:30, families had filled nearly every seat in the community center, creating an audience of almost 200 people who trusted Marcus Sterling to provide expert guidance about protecting their life savings. Parents quieted children as conversations tapered off, giving Marcus the complete attention of people who had no idea they were about to witness the systematic destruction of someone they'd considered a pillar of their community. Ladies and gentlemen, friends and neighbors. Marcus began his voice carrying clearly across the silent gathering with the practiced authority of someone who had successfully deceived entire communities for 7 years. Thank you for joining me tonight to discuss our community's financial future. I wish I could tell you that the news is entirely positive, but informed citizens can protect themselves and their families if they understand the challenges we're facing together. Elena felt sick watching neighbors who had no idea they were listening to someone who had spent years perfecting techniques for stealing everything they'd worked to build. Marcus's opening was designed to establish credibility through apparent honesty about difficult conditions, preparing his audience to accept his guidance during the manufactured crises he would introduce later in his presentation. Marcus clicked through professionally designed slides displaying impressive charts and graphs about market trends, interest rates, and economic forecasts that were based on legitimate data, but carefully selected to create anxiety about financial security. Elena recognized his methodology from 3 months of study, mix accurate information with subtle manipulation use, technical language to establish expertise, then introduce fabricated threats that would create dependency on his specialized guidance. The convergence of these economic factors over the next 12 to 18 months will create unprecedented challenges for homeowners throughout Colorado. Marcus continued his tone, shifting to the confidential authority of someone sharing insider knowledge with trusted friends. Some of you may have already experienced early indicators of these pressures: unexpected changes in property tax assessments, complications with mortgage refinancing, concerns about healthcare costs, affecting your retirement planning. Elena recognized the language of manufactured crisis, the same techniques Marcus had used to terrorize dozens of families into desperate asset sales across multiple states. He was identifying vulnerabilities in real time, studying his audience's reactions to determine which families would be most susceptible to the psychological manipulation campaign that would follow tonight's initial contact. Now I want to address some specific concerns about municipal development projects and infrastructure changes that will directly affect property values in our immediate neighborhood. Marcus said, preparing to introduce fabricated information about upcoming construction projects and zoning changes that would create panic about immediate threats to their home values. But his carefully prepared slides didn't appear on the projection screens. Instead, the large displays that Marcus had specifically requested for his community investment presentation now showed a completely different kind of financial information, bank records, documenting systematic transfers between Marcus's shell companies, property acquisition records showing below-market purchases from desperate families, and detailed timelines of victim targeting and asset extraction across multiple states. The first slide displayed Marcus's own email sent to his network coordinator, Rachel Wong, 8 months earlier with the subject line, Pine Haven Heights Final Extraction Phase, Target Assessment Complete. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as people read Marcus's words projected in large font for the entire community. Community penetration optimal for maximum asset recovery before Utah relocation. Trust levels exceptionally high, victim awareness minimal. Recommend accelerated timeline for systematic liquidation, targeting health vulnerabilities, recent family losses, and isolated demographic profiles. Priority extraction list attached with psychological assessment protocols. Marcus stood frozen at the podium, his confident presentation completely derailed by evidence of his own criminal planning, displayed for everyone he'd intended to victimize. The wireless presentation remote in his hand was useless. Elena had ensured that he would have no control over what appeared on the screens he'd requested to identify his final victims. What the hell is happening here? Marcus said, his voice no longer carrying practiced authority. but confusion and the first sharp edge of panic as he recognized that his carefully orchestrated presentation had been completely compromised by someone who understood his methods better than he'd ever imagined possible. Elena stepped forward from her position at the control station, holding her own wireless microphone and looking directly at the man she'd shared a life with for 8 years, while he systematically planned the financial destruction of everyone who trusted him. "Hello, Marcus," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the stunned gathering with the authority of someone who had spent 2 decades exposing sophisticated criminals in far more dangerous environments. "I think it's time our neighbors learned the truth about the financial advisor they've been trusting with their futures." The transformation in Elena's demeanor was immediately apparent to everyone present. Gone was the quietly supportive wife who had deferred to Marcus's expertise in financial matters. In her place stood someone who commanded attention through professional competence rather than social pleasantries, someone whose voice carried the confidence of experience, rather than the uncertainty Marcus had spent months cultivating in her responses to his manipulation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elena announced to the silent crowd, her voice cutting through the shocked atmosphere with surgical precision. "My name is Elena Vasquez Sterling, and for the past 3 months, I have been conducting an undercover federal investigation into the most sophisticated suburban financial predation scheme in Colorado history." The revelation sent a wave of confused murmurs through the gathering as people struggled to process what they were hearing. The woman they'd known as Marcus's supportive wife was claiming to be a federal investigator who had been systematically gathering evidence against her own husband. The cognitive dissonance was so complete that several attendees looked around uncertainly, wondering if this was some kind of elaborate misunderstanding or community theater gone wrong. But the evidence on the projection screens was undeniably real, and Elena's presentation continued with the methodical precision of someone who had spent months preparing for this exact moment. "The man you've trusted as your financial advisor has been systematically identifying vulnerable families, manufacturing financial crises, and manipulating you into selling your homes for significantly below market value to companies he secretly controls." Elena continued clicking to the next series of evidence slides that showed a comprehensive organizational chart of Marcus's criminal network. The screens now displayed photographs, contact information, and specific criminal roles for each member of the conspiracy that had stolen over $15 million from families across 5 states. Rachel Wong, the property inspector who had manufactured structural emergencies in dozens of homes. Tom Bradley, the loan officer who had created artificial financing complications that forced desperate refinancing. Dr. Patricia Vance, the psychiatrist who had diagnosed expensive treatment requirements for conditions that didn't exist. 12 other corrupt professionals who had enabled the systematic destruction of hundreds of families while generating enormous profits for a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for 7 years. "This is completely insane," Marcus said, finding his voice as the implications of Elena's revelation began to penetrate his shock. "Elena, what are you doing? These people are going to think you've had some kind of breakdown. This is exactly the kind of behavior that Dr. Vance warned us about. The paranoid thinking, the conspiracy theories, the inability to distinguish between reality and imagination." Elena recognized Marcus's response as a final attempt to use the psychological manipulation techniques that had been successful throughout their marriage. Even faced with irrefutable evidence of his crimes displayed in front of 200 witnesses, he was trying to gaslight her into believing that her accurate perceptions were signs of mental illness requiring his protective intervention. But Elena was no longer the isolated woman who had questioned her own judgment when confronted with Marcus's systematic undermining of her confidence. 3 months of federal investigation had restored her professional identity and demonstrated that her instincts had been accurate all along. "Marcus, the paranoid thinking and conspiracy theories you're describing are actually comprehensive federal evidence that will support your prosecution under RICO statutes," Elena replied calmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades documenting sophisticated criminal enterprises. "The inability to distinguish between reality and imagination belongs to someone who convinced himself that his victims would never be smart enough or strong enough to fight back." Elena clicked to the next series of evidence slides, and the screens now displayed property records that traced ownership of Pine Haven Investment Holdings and 6 related shell companies directly to Marcus and his conspirators. The documentation showed a complex web of corporate entities designed to obscure the source of stolen assets while providing legal cover for systematic financial predation. The crowd's reaction shifted from confused murmurs to focused attention as people began recognizing the scope and sophistication of what Elena was revealing. These weren't vague accusations or conspiracy theories. They were comprehensive financial records that demonstrated systematic criminal activity affecting their entire community. Tom Henderson stood up from his seat in the third row, his voice shaking with rage that had been building for 2 years since losing his family's home to what he'd believed was a series of unfortunate coincidences and poor financial decisions. Marcus, this documentation shows that you knew about my job loss 3 weeks before I was laid off. Tom said, his words carrying clearly across the silent gathering. It shows that you used that advance information to coordinate with that property inspector to fabricate foundation problems that forced us to sell our house at a loss of $68,000. The screens now displayed Marcus's detailed manipulation timeline for the Henderson family, including advance notification of the plant closure through corrupt contacts in the company's human resources department coordination with Rachel Wong, to fabricate structural assessments that would create artificial urgency and financial projections showing the exact profit margins generated by forcing their desperate sale to Pinehaven Investment Holdings. Tom, you have to understand that this is all being taken completely out of context. Marcus began, his voice carrying the patronizing tone he'd perfected for explaining away legitimate concerns from people he was systematically victimizing. Business relationships are complex, and sometimes market information becomes available through perfectly legitimate professional networks. The foundation issues with your house were identified by licensed professionals using standard assessment protocols. But Tom Henderson was no longer willing to accept Marcus's explanations, especially with comprehensive evidence of deliberate fraud displayed for the entire community to examine. Standard assessment protocols. Tom's voice rose with anger that surprised everyone who knew him as a soft-spoken man who rarely confronted anyone about anything. Marcus, this timeline shows that you paid Rachel Wong to create false moisture readings and fabricated structural damage reports. It shows that you coordinated the timing of her emergency assessment with my job loss to maximize financial pressure when we were least able to think clearly about our options. The evidence was devastating in its specificity and impossible to dismiss as misunderstanding or coincidence. Marcus's own obsessive documentation had created complete records of criminal intent and coordination that made denial futile. But Marcus wasn't finished attempting to control the narrative through psychological manipulation, even with federal evidence destroying his credibility in front of 200 witnesses. Tom, I understand that you're looking for someone to blame for a difficult situation, but these documents have obviously been altered or taken out of context by someone who isn't thinking clearly. Marcus said, his voice taking on the concerned authority of someone dealing with unreasonable accusations from a person who needed professional help. Elena has been under enormous stress lately, and Dr. Vance has been working with us to address some concerning changes in her mental health. This kind of elaborate conspiracy thinking is exactly what we've been worried about. Elena recognized this as Marcus's final attempt to position her as mentally unstable while maintaining his role as the concerned husband trying to protect their community from her allegedly delusional accusations. It was the same technique he'd used throughout their marriage. When confronted with evidence of his deception, he would suggest that Elena's perceptions were unreliable and that her questions indicated psychological problems rather than accurate threat assessment. But Elena was no longer isolated and vulnerable to his gaslighting techniques. She had 3 months of federal evidence, professional law enforcement support, and the restored confidence that came from using her investigative skills to expose exactly the kind of sophisticated criminal she'd spent 2 decades hunting in international settings. Dr. Patricia Vance has indeed been working with us, Marcus. Elena replied, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who controlled every aspect of the situation. But not in the way you're suggesting. Elena clicked to the next evidence display, and the screens now showed Dr. Vance's communications with Marcus about Elena's psychological manipulation timeline, including detailed strategies for undermining her confidence, isolating her from professional support networks, and creating artificial dependency on Marcus's guidance and protection. Dr. Vance has been providing you with neurotoxins to create artificial neurological symptoms that would justify expensive medical testing and treatment. Elena continued, her voice steady, despite the emotional cost of exposing such intimate manipulation in front of their entire community. She's been documenting my responses to systematic psychological manipulation to support a diagnosis of treatment-resistant depression that would require residential care costing exactly the amount my inherited house and investment portfolio could provide through forced liquidation. The revelation that Marcus had been deliberately poisoning his own wife sent a wave of horrified gasps through the gathering. People who had considered Marcus a trusted friend and neighbor were learning that he was capable of calculated cruelty that went far beyond financial fraud into systematic psychological and physical abuse. But Elena's most devastating revelation was yet to come. The elaborate conspiracy thinking Marcus is describing actually belongs to someone who spent 8 years planning the systematic destruction of everyone who trusted him, Elena said, clicking to display the files that would reveal how their entire marriage had been a calculated long-term manipulation designed to steal her family's legacy. Marcus Sterling didn't meet me by chance 8 years ago at the Denver Art Gallery, Elena announced, her voice carrying across the stunned gathering despite the emotional cost of exposing such intimate deception in front of neighbors and colleagues. He stalked me for months, researching my background and identifying me as a long-term target because of my substantial assets and my isolation following traumatic experiences as a war photographer, covering conflicts in Syria, Bosnia, and Afghanistan. The screens displayed Marcus's pre-relationship research files on Elena's psychological profile, financial assets, and vulnerability assessment following her experiences in international conflict zones. Every romantic gesture, every shared interest, every moment that had convinced Elena he was her soulmate had been carefully calculated to create emotional dependency that would make her vulnerable to systematic financial exploitation over time. The documentation included drafts of love letters Marcus had practiced but never sent, testing different emotional approaches to determine which manipulation techniques would be most effective. Detailed notes about Elena's recovery from war photography trauma with clinical recommendations about how to exploit her experiences to create dependency on his support and guidance. Strategic plans for isolating her from professional colleagues and gradually convincing her that her investigative instincts were signs of unresolved PTSD, rather than accurate threat assessment. For 8 years, I believed I was married to a man who loved me. Elena continued, her voice remaining steady, despite the obvious emotional cost of revealing such personal betrayal. Instead, I was married to a predator who was systematically conditioning me for psychological breakdown that would justify liquidating my assets to pay for medical treatment I didn't need for conditions I didn't have. The crowd was completely silent now, understanding that they were witnessing not just criminal exposure, but the complete destruction of a marriage that had been built on 8 years of systematic deception. Even the federal agents positioned throughout the venue paused in their preparations, recognizing the extraordinary personal courage required to expose such intimate manipulation in front of an entire community. But Elena wasn't finished documenting the scope of Marcus's betrayal. Elena displayed Marcus's extraction timeline for her case, including detailed coordination with Dr. Patricia Vance to implement a manufactured health crisis that would justify residential psychiatric treatment costing exactly the amount Elena's inherited house and investment portfolio could provide through emergency liquidation. The personal files included audio recordings of Elena's private conversations captured through surveillance equipment Marcus had installed throughout their home photographs, taken without her knowledge during her most vulnerable moments of recovery from war trauma, and clinical assessments of her emotional responses that had guided Marcus's manipulation strategies throughout their marriage. Every suggestion that I was being paranoid about our neighbors' financial problems, every gentle redirection away from questions about our household finances, every encouragement to focus on domestic happiness rather than maintaining my professional networks was part of a calculated campaign to neutralize what Marcus identified as the primary threat to his operation. Elena explained, her voice growing stronger as she reclaimed her professional identity in front of people who had only known her as Marcus's supportive wife. My investigative capabilities from 22 years of international journalism. The revelation transformed the gathering from shocked observers into active participants in understanding how they had all been systematically deceived by someone who had studied human psychology specifically to exploit their deepest vulnerabilities and strongest trust bonds. Rebecca Walsh, the 78-year-old widow who had traveled from Idaho to witness Marcus's exposure, stood up with assistance from her walker and addressed the gathering in a voice that carried surprising strength. I want everyone here to understand what this man did to my family. Rebecca said, her words cutting through the silence with the authority of someone who had survived decades of life's challenges and refused to be dismissed as a confused elderly victim. Marcus Sterling convinced me that my dead husband had made terrible financial decisions that left me unable to maintain our home. He showed me fabricated maintenance reports, created artificial emergencies that required immediate expensive repairs, and systematically convinced me that my 43 years of marriage had been built on my husband's financial incompetence. Rebecca's voice grew stronger as she continued, and Elena realized that exposing Marcus's crimes was providing his victims with the opportunity to reclaim their dignity and challenge the narrative of personal failure he had constructed around their victimization. I spent 2 years blaming myself for not being smart enough or strong enough to preserve what Harold and I had built together, Rebecca continued. I moved into senior housing believing that I had failed as a wife and as a financial partner. But Harold wasn't incompetent, and I wasn't a failure. We were targeted by a criminal who studied grief psychology to identify exactly when widows would be most vulnerable to emotional manipulation. Elena clicked to the next evidence display showing Marcus's detailed psychological profile of Rebecca Walsh that included observations about her grief patterns, her isolation from extended family, and strategic recommendations for creating artificial dependency on his financial guidance during the anniversary periods when her emotional defenses would be lowest. The documentation revealed that Marcus had timed his approach to coincide with the anniversary of Harold's death, when Rebecca's grief would override her natural skepticism about urgent financial decisions. He had systematically convinced her that Harold's financial planning had been inadequate, that the house maintenance costs were beyond her capabilities, and that selling quickly to Pinehaven Investment Holdings was her only option for preserving any financial security for her remaining years. But Rebecca Walsh wasn't finished with her testimony. This man didn't just steal my money, she said, her voice carrying across the silent gathering with the moral authority of someone who had finally understood the full scope of what had been done to her. He stole 2 years of my grief, convinced me that my marriage had been built on lies, and made me question 43 years of love and partnership with the most honest man I ever knew. The crowd began to understand that Marcus's crimes went far beyond financial fraud. He had been systematically destroying the emotional foundations of families and communities, weaponizing grief, fear, and trust to generate profits, while leaving his victims to blame themselves for circumstances he had artificially created. As Rebecca sat down, other victim families began sharing their stories, creating a comprehensive picture of psychological warfare that had been conducted against multiple communities over 7 years of criminal operations. David and Sarah Chen, Elena's immediate neighbors, stood up together to address the gathering. Elena had discovered that they were among Marcus's planned final targets, scheduled for systematic financial destruction that would have begun the following month with a manufactured investment crisis requiring emergency asset liquidation. Marcus has been our financial advisor for 3 years, David said, his voice carrying the bewilderment of someone discovering that trusted guidance had actually been preparation for victimization. He convinced us to restructure our retirement accounts in ways that we now realize would have made us vulnerable to exactly the kind of emergency liquidation he was planning to recommend next month. Sarah Chen added her own testimony. He's been asking detailed questions about our family relationships, our health concerns, our emotional responses to financial stress. We thought he was being thorough and caring, but he was actually profiling us for systematic exploitation. Elena realized that Marcus's preparation for targeting the Chens had been even more sophisticated than his other operations, because he'd had daily access to them as neighbors, allowing him to study their psychological vulnerabilities with unprecedented detail. Agent Sarah Chen, no relation to David and Sarah Chen, moved through the crowd with federal agents who were no longer maintaining their cover as ordinary community members. The sound of approaching sirens indicated that coordinated arrests were being executed simultaneously at the homes and offices of Rachel Wong, Tom Bradley, Dr. Patricia Vance, and 15 other professionals who had enabled Marcus's criminal enterprise across multiple states. Marcus Sterling, you're under arrest for federal charges of fraud conspiracy, racketeering, money laundering, elder abuse, and assault through deliberate poisoning. Agent Chen announced, approaching the stage with backup agents positioned to prevent any escape attempt. Marcus looked around desperately at the faces of people who had trusted him with their financial security and community leadership, seeing nothing but horror and disgust reflected back from neighbors who now understood exactly who he really was. This is completely insane, Marcus said, his voice rising to near shouting level as the reality of his situation began to penetrate his shock. Elena has obviously had some kind of psychological break. Dr. Vance warned me this might happen. The paranoid delusions, the conspiracy thinking, the inability to distinguish between reality and elaborate fantasies. You can't seriously believe that I've been running some kind of criminal enterprise from our neighborhood. But Elena's evidence presentation wasn't finished, and Marcus's desperate attempts to maintain his manipulation techniques were only providing additional demonstration of the psychological warfare he had been conducting against his victims for years. The paranoid delusions and conspiracy thinking Marcus is describing are actually comprehensive federal intelligence that will support prosecutions under RICO statutes. Elena replied, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had spent 3 months building an unassailable case. The inability to distinguish between reality and elaborate fantasies belongs to someone who convinced himself that his victims would never be intelligent enough or determined enough to expose his crimes. Elena clicked to display the final component of her evidence presentation communications between Marcus and his contacts in Park City, Utah, where the network had planned to relocate after completing their Pine Haven Heights operations. The screens showed detailed victim assessments for 43 families in Park City who had been researched and profiled for systematic financial destruction over the following 2 years. Property records revealed that Marcus had already purchased a house and established a financial planning practice in preparation for targeting an estimated $15 million in assets through manufactured crises and psychological manipulation. Ladies and gentlemen, what you're seeing here represents planned crimes against families who have no idea they've been selected for systematic victimization, Elena announced. If this criminal network hadn't been stopped tonight, dozens of families in Utah would have lost their homes, their savings, and their emotional security to the same techniques that have been used against victims across 5 states over 7 years. The scope of Marcus's planned criminal activity was so comprehensive that several people in the gathering began crying as they understood how many families would have been destroyed if Elena hadn't risked everything to expose the conspiracy. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source, Mrs. Chen David's 84-year-old mother, who lived in the guest house behind their property and had seemed like an unlikely target for financial fraud. Mrs. Chen stood up slowly, supported by her walker, and addressed the gathering in clear, determined English that carried the moral authority of someone who had survived decades of challenges and refused to be dismissed as a confused elderly victim. "I want everyone to know what this man tried to do to my family," she said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "Marcus Sterling convinced me that my son David was stealing my Social Security money. He showed me fake bank statements, told me David was planning to put me in a nursing home to take my savings." David Chen's face went white as he understood how thoroughly Marcus had been manipulating his family dynamics, attempting to turn parents against children to create the isolation necessary for successful financial exploitation. He said David would deny it, would say I was getting old and confused. Mrs. Chen continued, her voice carrying across the silent gathering. He said the only way to protect myself was to give him power of attorney over my accounts. I almost signed papers that would let him control everything I saved in 60 years of work in this country. Elena realized that Mrs. Chen's testimony demonstrated another dimension of Marcus's psychological warfare, his systematic effort to destroy intergenerational trust and family bonds that provided natural protection against financial predation. He was going to help me move to a nice retirement community where I would be safe from my own family, who were supposedly trying to steal from me, Mrs. Chen concluded. But the retirement community was probably another part of his network where he could control elderly people who had been isolated from their families and systematically drain their assets without outside interference. Agent Chen stepped forward to address Mrs. Chen's revelation, recognizing its significance for the broader federal case against Marcus's network. "Mrs. Chen, we've identified similar retirement facilities in other states where this network has operated," Agent Chen confirmed. "Your testimony helps us understand how elderly victims were isolated and controlled after being separated from their family support systems." As federal agents moved to arrest Marcus, Elena addressed the gathering one final time to explain the broader implications of what they had witnessed and the community's role in preventing similar crimes in the future. "What you've seen tonight represents more than the exposure of one criminal network," Elena said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 2 decades documenting sophisticated criminal enterprises. "You've witnessed how entire communities can be systematically infiltrated and exploited by predators who study human psychology to identify and manipulate our deepest vulnerabilities." Elena explained how Marcus's network had perfected techniques for weaponizing trust, grief, fear, and family relationships to generate enormous profits while leaving victims to blame themselves for circumstances that had been artificially created through sophisticated manipulation. But you've also seen how communities can protect themselves when they work together with proper information and professional support. Elena continued, every person who shared their story tonight, every family who traveled from other states to provide testimony, every neighbor who refused to accept that their financial problems were personal failures rather than systematic victimization. All of you have contributed to stopping a criminal enterprise that would have destroyed hundreds of additional families if it had been allowed to continue. The gathering had transformed from a neighborhood meeting into an impromptu community healing session as families connected with each other and began to understand that their experiences were part of a systematic campaign rather than individual misfortunes or poor decisions. Elena's investigation and tonight's revelation became the foundation for comprehensive changes in how communities could protect themselves from sophisticated financial predation. The evidence would support federal legislation enhancing penalties for crimes targeting elderly victims, provide templates for community-based fraud prevention programs, and establish protocols for law enforcement agencies to identify and investigate similar criminal networks. But perhaps most importantly, the Pine Haven Heights community had transformed from a hunting ground for sophisticated predators into a model for collective resistance and mutual protection that would prevent similar crimes from taking root in their neighborhood ever again. As Marcus was led away in handcuffs, Elena reflected on the personal transformation that had occurred during 3 months of the most intensive and dangerous investigation of her career. The woman who had believed her investigative skills were part of a retired past had rediscovered capabilities that surpassed anything she had accomplished during 22 years of international journalism. Elena had spent decades documenting crimes committed by strangers in distant countries, always as an outside observer, recording events for audiences who would never directly experience what she had witnessed. The Pine Haven Heights investigation had required her to maintain perfect operational security while living with her target to gather evidence while being systematically betrayed by someone she loved, and to build a federal case while protecting herself from both psychological manipulation and physical harm. The skills were the same, but the stakes had been personal in ways that made every discovery more urgent and every victory more meaningful. When Marcus was finally sentenced to federal prison, Elena would feel not just professional satisfaction at a story well documented, but personal relief that a predator who had threatened her community would never again be able to harm innocent families. 5 years later, Elena would receive letters from communities across the country who had used the warning signs and protection protocols developed from the Pine Haven Heights case to recognize and stop similar criminal operations before they could destroy local families. But tonight, as Elena watched federal agents secure the community center and begin processing evidence that would support the most comprehensive financial predation prosecution in federal history, she understood that the investigation had accomplished something far more significant than just stopping one criminal network. Elena Vasquez Sterling had transformed from victim to investigator to community protector, proving that the most dangerous opponents sophisticated criminals can face are often the people they have systematically underestimated. People who possess professional skills, life experience, and the moral clarity that comes from understanding exactly what's at stake when predators target the communities and families we love. The hunt was over, justice had been served, and the community Marcus had seen as his hunting ground had become a fortress protecting families from those who mistake kindness for weakness and trust for vulnerability. The transformation was complete, and the legacy would endure for generations of families who would never know how close they came to losing everything to someone who had perfected the art of stealing dreams while smiling like a trusted friend. The woman Marcus had targeted for systematic destruction had become the architect of his complete downfall, using his own methods and documentation to ensure that his punishment would be as thorough and permanent as the devastation he had planned for her and dozens of other innocent families. Elena's story reminds us that the most dangerous betrayals often come wrapped in the language of love and protection. When someone systematically undermines your reality while stealing your achievements, they're not just committing crimes against your wallet. They're waging war against your very sense of self. But here's what Marcus never understood. True strength isn't about controlling others through manipulation and lies. It's about building something real, something lasting, something that can withstand the light of truth. Elena transformed from a woman who'd willingly stepped back from her career to someone who rediscovered that expertise doesn't disappear with age. It deepens with wisdom. She learned that the voice telling her, "You're being paranoid," was often the very voice she needed to question most. The most powerful lesson here isn't about revenge. It's about the quiet courage it takes to investigate your own life when something feels wrong. When your instincts are screaming, but everyone around you is saying you're overreacting, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust yourself enough to dig deeper. Elena's story shows us that documentation beats desperation, that patience beats panic, and that the truth, when properly revealed, is the most devastating weapon of all. Marcus spent months planning Elena's destruction, but he made one fatal error: he underestimated the woman whose life he was trying to steal. The systematic psychological manipulation designed to make her compliant instead motivated her to build an ironclad case for his complete downfall. Sometimes the best revenge isn't plotting someone's destruction. It's simply refusing to let them destroy you. Elena's investigation didn't just save her own future. It created a blueprint that law enforcement agencies now use to identify similar operations nationwide. Her refusal to stay quiet when love became manipulation saved not just her own legacy, but the futures of families she'd never even met. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop protecting someone who's using that protection to harm others. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. These stories dive deep into the psychology of betrayal and the sweet satisfaction of strategic justice, exploring what happens when people finally stop accepting manipulation and start fighting back with intelligence and evidence. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Tomorrow, we're bringing you another story that will make you question everything you think you know about trust power and the lengths people will go to protect what they've built. Trust me, you won't want to miss it.